We've seen several arguments for the existence of God already in this course. We saw St. Anselm's famous ontological argument. We saw St. Thomas's famous 5 ways. We also saw St. Thomas give a different kind of cosmological argument in his De Ente et Essentia, on being in essence, which was based on a similar sort of argument that we saw Avicenna give. Now, the next argument that we're going to look at, which is in many ways sort of a super argument, I'm calling it an epic argument for the existence of God, is the argument for the existence of God from Blessed John Duns Scotus. Blessed John Duns Scotus was a Scottish Franciscan philosopher theologian. He is blessed, not a saint, but a blessed. He was nicknamed the Subtle Doctor because of just how complex and subtle many of his points were, as we'll see, especially in his argument for the existence of God. As we run through several topics that he covered, we'll see that he is the doctor of subtle complexity. He makes even more fine-grained distinctions than Aquinas does. In theology, Blessed John Duns Scotus is perhaps most famous for his defense of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. But on the other side, we also get the name of dumb person, a dunce, and the dunce cap we get from Duns Scotus. So we get sort of these bad nicknames for two of the leading characters in the medieval period. Aquinas' nickname was the dumb ox, and Duns Scotus' nickname, right, the dunce. Seemed to be given to them by people who didn't quite understand just how incredibly intelligent these people were. Blessed John Duns Scotus was born around 1265 and died around 1308. He died pretty young. Like Aquinas, he died right when he was still sort of in the thick of teaching and still working on several important works. To put those dates in context, Aquinas was born around 1225 and was around until 1274, which means that Scotus did overlap. His life did overlap with Aquinas for a bit. And the main medieval philosopher that comes after Scotus, Occam, his dates are 1285 to 1347. So he overlaps with Occam a bit as well. So he's sort of in between Aquinas and Occam. Scotus is one of the big philosophers during this medieval period. He's a Franciscan philosopher who disagrees with Aquinas on a whole bunch of things. We'll find that Occam later disagrees with Scotus on a lot of things. What are his major works? His major works are his sentence commentary. Remember the sentences of Peter Lombard, and that all professors during this period had to give a sort of commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences in order to qualify to be a master, in order to be able to teach theology. And so, like others, Scotus gave something like a sentence commentary in various forms and in various stages of revision. So let me go over a little bit of the basics on the stages of revision of Scotus's sentence commentary. This is a way of distinguishing the state that his commentaries are in, which actually gets is the way in which we sort through the states of other philosophers' commentaries in this period. So there are actually 3 forms that we get Scotus's commentary on the sentences. In the first form, it comes as what's known as a lectura. These are Scotus's own lecture notes. He would give a lecture for his commentary on the sentences, and the notes sometimes would be copied over, and so we would have the notes that he used while he was lecturing on that. The second state that his commentary on the sentences can be is called an ordinatio. And the ordinatio is when those lecture notes that he used are polished and edited so as to be distributed. So the lectura aren't things that Scotus or any of the other figures that we find their commentaries in the lectura form. They weren't intended for distribution. They weren't intended to be read by other people. But the ordinatio is when he goes back and sorts through those notes so as to be presentable such that people can read them. So in many ways, ordinatio is the best form that you can find the sentence commentary in. It's got the stamp of approval from the author, in this case, Scotus. The third way in which we can get the sentence commentaries from an author, and Scotus in particular, is in the form of what's known as a reportatio. A reportatio is not the lecture notes of the lecture given, not the edited lecture notes in the ordinatio, but a reportatio is when an author gives the lecture, but this is recorded by someone else. So these are the notes or the recording of the lecture recorded by someone else. So Scotus wouldn't have written that directly, and he wouldn't have seen those. He wouldn't have edited those either. So in some ways, the reportatio, if you get a good scribe, can be very good, but sometimes they'll copy things down incorrectly. The lectura is great, but it only gives us the basics. It only gives us the notes. So really what we're looking for here is the ordinatio. So when we see a work by Scotus referred to as an ordinatio, and many of the sections that we'll be reading from Scotus are from his ordinatio, this is essentially the equivalent of his summa. What we're getting is his most refined, most considered version of his commentary on the sentences, which covers, as we've seen, all sorts of different topics. Okay. In addition to his sentence commentary, Scotus also wrote several commentaries on Aristotle, one on Aristotle's De Anima, one on Aristotle's Metaphysics. He also held several quodlibet questions and edited those for publication later on. Now, I also want to talk about the tricky part about studying and researching Scotus, is that not all of his works are in the easiest form to read or research. And so let me give you the basics about 3 stages that a Latin text can be in, a medieval philosophical text can be in. So the first state that a Latin medieval text is in is the manuscript, either the original recording or a handwritten copy of that. And you'll have different copies, manuscripts of the same piece, and you'll find them throughout Europe in many different places. Sometimes they occasionally still uncover manuscripts that they haven't seen before. And the manuscripts are almost always in a kind of shorthand. You have to, even if your Latin is very good, you have to learn how to read manuscripts because manuscripts are in very abbreviated form. They're very tricky to be able to understand what the author is referring to, or especially because each author has their own sort of shorthand. So you have to learn the shorthand, different shorthand for each author. So you get all the manuscripts. And then at a certain point, the researchers, the scholars, they compile all the manuscripts, and what they do is sometimes the manuscripts will disagree on various points. They'll put it slightly different, right, in the different manuscripts. And so the next stage is to compile those manuscripts into a master Latin copy. So you find what most of the manuscripts say, you get it all consistent, you put it in a nice legible form without any of the abbreviations, and what you get when you put all the manuscripts together into the master copy, you get what is known as the critical edition. And then finally, after you have the critical editions of various texts, which are still in Latin, they're just the crisp and clear and consistent Latin version, the master Latin version, then finally authors or researchers can look at that and from that critical edition translate it into particular languages, such as translating them into English. Now, the tricky thing about Scotus is that not only are many of his works not translated into English, there are even several of his works that don't have a full critical edition yet. And the only way that you could read some of these texts is to go back into the manuscripts or to rely on other people who have read the manuscripts. And indeed, his major work, the Ordinatio for Scotus, we didn't even have a critical edition, a full critical edition, that is a full even master Latin copy, until 2013. That's very recent. So the tricky thing about studying and researching Scotus, as I've found, is not only is a lot of the stuff not in English, a lot of his stuff doesn't even have a master Latin copy. You have to be good at reading manuscripts, you have to do some digging, you have to go to libraries in order to study this well. All that stuff is in the background. That gives you a rundown of Scotus as a person, his major works. What are some of the major ideas that Scotus discusses in his works? We're going to discuss a couple. The one that I'm going to talk about in this video is Scotus's argument for the existence of God. We're also going to look at Scotus's perspective on the problem of universals and the individuation of material substances. We'll look at Scotus on the plurality of substantial forms. We'll look at Scotus on the nature of divine and human freedom, so his account of free will. And then finally, we'll look at Scotus's ethics. We'll look at his approach to the topic of what makes an action morally good or morally bad, and also his approach to the relationship between the divine law and the natural law. So that's the table of contents. That's that's the list of coming events. That's what we'll be talking about when we go through Scotus over the next several lectures. Today, what I'd like to talk about is I'd like to run through Duns Scotus's epic argument for the existence of God. And so I'm going to run through the handout that I've written for this. Make sure you've downloaded that one because it gives a sort of map of the argument and all of the shifting pieces. It's a really complex argument because there are many premises in the main argument, and then he defends each of those premises with sub-arguments, and each of those sub-arguments, the premises, he wants to provide further support and sometimes many different arguments. So what I try to do in the handout is try to give you an overall map of at least the major moves that he makes in this argument. So I'm going to walk you through it, and I'm going to point out the various ways, and I think this actually works out really nicely, is that we've seen several arguments for the existence of God. Scotus's epic argument for the existence of God is in many ways a fusion of all of the arguments we've already seen. He's going to bring all the resources together to try to provide something like a master argument for the existence of God. So I'm going to point out the ways in which he seems to be borrowing from or giving arguments similar to authors that we've seen already. I'm going to identify points at which maybe it's slightly unclear what he's doing or why he's doing it. And then I want to open it up to you guys on the discussion board about what you think about this argument, whether you can see any other points that he's borrowed from other authors, or you think that I have misinterpreted some move that he makes, or you're unclear about some other move that he makes. But that's what we'll go to. Let me run through the argument. So Duns Scotus's epic argument for the existence of God is in many ways, right? A cosmological argument. It's got elements of ontological arguments. It's got elements, as we'll see, of Avicenna's argument. It's got elements of just about all of Aquinas' 5 ways. He's going to try to put these together into a master argument. So here's the structure of his main argument, if you're following on the top of the handout. The main argument has 6 premises with a conclusion. Premise 1, there exists a first efficient cause. Premise 2, there exists an ultimate final cause. Premise 3, there exists a maximally perfect or most eminent being. Premise 4, anything that meets any one of these descriptions would also meet the other 2 as well. Premise 5, there could be at most one thing that meets all 3 descriptions. Premise 6, such a being would also have to be infinite in each respect. And putting all these pieces together, the conclusion is that therefore there exists a being infinite in each respect, and this we all call God. So once again, what we've got in premise 1, there exists a first efficient cause. He's going to try, part of it is something like a cosmological argument, similar to what we saw Aquinas give. Premise 2, it looks like there's going to be something like an argument for final causality. It's going to be something like Aquinas' 5th way. And then the third major component of the argument is that he's going to try to argue for the existence of a maximally perfect being. It's something like either Anselm's ontological argument or something like Aquinas' 4-way. It's the argument from eminence. So 3 maybe major components to start off with. He calls this the triple primacy. That there exists a first efficient cause, that there exists an ultimate final cause, and that there exists a maximally perfect being. And what's tricky about this argument is that for each one of those premises, 1, 2, and 3, each one of them have, he says, 3 sub-conclusions. That such a being is first in the relevant respect, or ultimate in the relevant respect. That such a being is uncausable in the relevant respect, and that such a being actually exists. So he's got 6 premises in the main argument. The first 3 are sort of main foundations for the argument, and each one of those has 3 parts to it, and then he's going to provide various arguments for each parts of each of those 3 arguments, and then provide sub-arguments in support of those arguments. It gets very complicated. But so far we've got the main argument, 6 premises, conclusion, and each one of the first 3 premises has 3 parts to it. And so for each of the first 3 premises, Scotus offers separate arguments, sometimes several arguments, in support of each sub-conclusion. I want to focus a little bit on his argument for a first efficient cause. It should look pretty familiar to us. So his argument for premise 1, that there should be a first efficient cause, here's this sub-argument in favor of that component of 1. 1.1, some being can be affected. 1.2, that being must be affected by itself, or by nothing, or by something other than itself. 1.3, not by nothing, since that which is nothing is a cause of nothing. 1.4, not by itself, since there is no thing that makes or generates itself. 1.5, hence by something other than itself, which we can call A. So there are certain things that are efficiently caused, and they're not efficiently caused by nothing, and they're not efficiently caused by themselves, since they got to be efficiently caused by something else. Something is caused by something other than itself, which we can call A. Now, A, the thing that's efficiently causing the first thing, is either a first efficient cause or is affected by something other than itself. If A is the first efficient cause, then he's got his conclusion. If A is affected by something other than itself, let's call this thing B. B now is either a first efficient cause or it is affected by something other than itself, and so on to infinity. By premise 1.10, an infinite series of efficient causes is impossible, and so therefore at some point there must be a first efficient cause. We should see this as very similar to the way in which Aquinas argued in his second way. Well, why think that an infinite series of efficient causes is impossible? Scotus gives a couple arguments for this conclusion. Let's take a look at the first argument that he gives. This is sort of the main structure of his argument for why he thinks that you can't have an infinite series of efficient causes. Premise 1.10.1, an infinite essentially ordered efficient causal series is impossible. So here he's going to distinguish between essentially ordered efficient causal series and an accidentally ordered efficient causal series. We saw this distinction in Aquinas. And Aquinas, too, thought that you couldn't have an infinite essentially ordered efficient causal series. He did think, however, that you could have an infinite accidentally ordered efficient causal series. Once again, the most basic distinction between an essentially ordered efficient causal series and an accidentally ordered efficient causal series is that an accidentally ordered efficient causal series is usually a temporal series. Something causes something, and then there's the effect, and then later on that effect causes its own effect, and later on that effect causes a further effect, and so on. Whereas an essentially ordered causal series is one that takes place, the entire chain of causes takes place all at the same time, all simultaneously. This thing is being held in existence by something else, which is being held in existence by something else, and so on. That's the major distinction. Now, Scotus is going to try to argue that an infinitely essentially ordered efficient causal series is impossible, like Aquinas thought as well. Call this proposition A. But he also thinks that an infinite accidentally ordered efficient causal series is impossible unless an essentially ordered causal series is positive. Call that proposition B. So he's got a sort of dual strategy here. He's going to try to argue that essentially ordered causal series can't be infinite, but also that anytime you have an infinite accidentally ordered efficient causal series, it assumes something like an essentially ordered causal series, which can't be infinite, and so you got to have a first, right? Even if you have an infinity in the accidentally ordered. Okay, so therefore an infinite series of efficient causes is impossible. Okay. Now, remember proposition A, the idea that there cannot be an infinite series of essentially ordered efficient causes. He actually gives 5 different arguments for thinking that they can't have an infinite series of essentially ordered efficient causes. I'll just include his first argument and his fifth argument. The first argument goes something like this, and all I could really trace out is just the first premise. How does the rest of this sub-argument go? I'm not quite sure, but here seems to be the major point that he introduces. He says that an infinite essentially ordered efficient causal series would still be itself a dependent being, since it would still be composed entirely of dependent beings. And so that series would still need to be affected by something other than itself. I think what's going on in this first argument is that this is very similar to a move that we saw Avicenna make in his argument for the existence of God. The idea is that if you had, right, an infinite series of things causing other things, the explanation couldn't be complete because that whole series itself would still need a cause, an efficient cause, because it itself would still be contingent or dependent entity. It doesn't have the explanation for its own existence built into it. So it would need something outside of itself. And so the only way to place something outside of it is for something to be not dependent, not contingent in this way. And if it's not dependent, not contingent in this way, it's a first efficient cause. So any infinite series, right, would need a further explanation outside of itself. And the only explanation that would stop, that would offer the full explanation, is something that is a first efficient cause, something that is not a dependent entity, is not contingent, but is a necessary being. His second argument for thinking that you can't have essentially an infinite, essentially ordered efficient causal series mostly just establishes that it is possible that there be a first efficient cause. So the argument goes something like this. A1, efficient causal power does not necessarily imply any imperfection. A2, so it is at least possible that there exists something with efficient causal power which is completely lacking in any imperfection. A3, any efficient cause that was itself dependent on some other efficient cause would be lacking in complete perfection. A4, and so it is at least possible that there exists something with efficient causal power which does not depend on any other efficient cause, that is, something that is unqualifiedly first. And his conclusion here, once again, is that therefore it is possible that there exists some efficient cause that is unqualifiedly first. Remember that there are three components, right, to each of his first three premises. That something would be first in the relevant respect, that such a being would be uncausable in the relevant respect, and that such a being would actually exist. Here maybe he's just establishing that a first efficient cause is, here's what it would mean for something to be first, and that it would have to be uncausable in the relevant respect. Now, here's where we are in the argument. We're still trying to establish that you can have an infinite series of essentially ordered efficient causes. The first proposition was just to say that, yes, you can't have that essentially ordered efficient causal series that's infinite. That's impossible. That was proposition A, and we've just seen two reasons that he tries to give for thinking that that's true. Proposition B says that if you had an infinite accidentally ordered efficient causal series, that would still need to introduce something like an essentially ordered causal series. Well, I think this is the case. This is his argument for proposition B of the 1.10 argument. This is on the second page of your handout. B1. An infinite accidentally ordered efficient causal series would be a temporal series, one in which each cause is prior in time to its effect. B2. In a temporal causal series, each cause does not depend for its causing at the time of its causing on any of the prior causes. A son generates whether his own father is dead or alive. B3. Rather, each cause depends for its causing at the time of its causing on the form or nature which it passes on. This is reliant on a conception of causation according to which what it means to cause something other to exist is to sort of pass on one's own nature or to pass on some particular form or attribute that the thing itself has. B4, the form or nature which is passed on in a temporal causal series is not itself a member of that series, but does exist simultaneously with each member. B5, and so in a temporal causal series, each cause does depend for its causing at the time of its causing on something outside of that series, namely the form or nature that's passed on. It's not itself a member of that series because it's there throughout. B6, but to say that each cause depends for its causing at the time of its causing on something outside of the series is to introduce an essentially ordered efficient causal series. Conclusion, therefore an infinite accidentally ordered efficient causal series is impossible unless an essentially ordered causal series is posited. So here's an interesting maneuver that I actually didn't really see very much in Aquinas, is that why think that there is an essentially ordered causal series in the first place? Why can't you just have accidentally ordered causal series? This is Scotus's argument for why you can't just have an accidentally ordered efficient causal series. That in order to make that work, in order to make sense of such a causal series, you have to introduce an essentially ordered causal series. And because, based on his arguments earlier, that you can't have an infinite essentially ordered efficient causal series, so what you're going to get is whatever kind of causes you introduce, right, you're going to have to stop somewhere with the first efficient cause. Now, it's interesting to me that he doesn't use the same sort of argument that Aquinas used for thinking that there has to be a first efficient cause. Remember, Aquinas' argument is something like, well, there has to be something holding up all the rest. In an essentially ordered efficient causal series, none of the members have their own causal power. It's all borrowed or derivative from the first. And so if you say that there isn't a first, then you don't have any explanation for how any of them are doing that. That doesn't seem to appear in Scotus's arguments here. You might think that you could add that to his support for thinking that you can have an essentially ordered, efficient causal series. Okay. Now remember that for each of the first three premises that there are three subconclusions, right? That such a thing would be first, that such a thing would be uncaused, and that such a thing exists. Now in our reading, it appears that we looked at arguments for thinking that there would have to be first, but his arguments for premise 1, subconclusion 2, that a first efficient cause is uncausable, those appear to me omitted from our reading. So I'll jump right to argument for premise 1, subconclusion 3, that a first efficient cause actually exists. And here's something like the argument here, 1a. If it is conceptually impossible for a given thing to exist from another, then if that thing can exist, it can exist of itself. 1b. But it is conceptually impossible for an unqualifiedly first efficient cause to exist from another. Otherwise, it wouldn't be unqualifiedly first. 1c, and that such a thing can exist is evident from the fifth argument given for A. See argument 2 for proposition A above. 1d, hence the unqualifiedly first efficient cause can exist from itself. 1e, whatever exists from itself exists necessarily. 1f, whatever exists necessarily actually exists. Conclusion, therefore, an unqualifiedly first efficient cause actually exists. So this is an interesting sort of argument. It's almost like he's arguing for, well, okay, it's possible that there be a first efficient cause. And if it's possible, it has to be actual, because if it is a first efficient cause, it would have to be something like a necessary being. And a necessary being exists of itself, and so therefore it's going to always exist because it carries within it its own explanation for its existence. The maneuver made here almost makes it sound like he's providing something like an ontological argument, similar to the modal ontological argument that we see from Ellen Plantinga, or similar to the second formulation of St. Anselm's argument, in which he makes a similar modal maneuver. A necessary being would have to exist, and so if something is possible, then it exists. It seems like a similar move is being made here by Scotus. Now, that's all just unpacking premise 1, the claim that there is a first efficient cause. What about the next two? Remember, the next two, that there exists an ultimate final cause, and that there exists a most eminent or maximally perfect being. I'm going to set aside his argument for why we should think that there's a most eminent or maximally perfect being, but I do want to talk about his argument for premise 2, that there exists an ultimate final cause. He says, roughly, that there exists an ultimate final cause is proved by 5 proofs similar to those offered for the first conclusion concerning the first efficient cause. And that he thinks that such a being exists is also proved in the same way as the parallel conclusion in the case of efficient causality. So he doesn't spell this out for us, and in some ways this is a slightly annoying feature of a lot of Scotus's work, is that he's so smart, he's so fast, that he doesn't slow down to spell out all the moves that he's making. But he thinks that you can argue for the existence of an ultimate final cause in similar ways as you can argue for first efficient cause. Now, how exactly we should fill that out, that's a good question. Maybe one of you will write your final paper on how to fill out that part of the argument, given that he says there should be arguments very similar to what were provided earlier on. So then I spent a lot of time on premise 1, considerably less time on premise 2 and 3, because Scotus spends considerably less time on premise 2 and 3. But let's say that he has established, right? He has established that there exists a first efficient cause, there exists an ultimate final cause, there exists a maximally perfect being. How does that get us God? He thinks we're not quite there yet. He thinks none of those by itself will establish the existence of God. So what's left? He still wants to, if you look at the main argument again, he still wants to establish that anything that meets any one of these descriptions would also meet the other two as well. He thinks that there could be at most one thing that meets all these 3 descriptions, and he thinks that such a being would have to also be infinite in each respect. And so therefore, there exists a being infinite in each respect, and this we call God. Interesting question on why he thinks you need to establish all 3 of these things, that they coincide, that there can only be one in order to establish the existence of God. Aquinas thinks it's enough just to establish the first efficient cause. So one question I have for you is to consider, maybe you'll add it to the discussion board, is why does he feel the need to do all 3 of these? Why does he need the triple primacy? Right? Why does he need to identify something that is first in all 3 ways? Why isn't one of them enough? But anyway, so premise 4 says that anything that meets any one of these descriptions would also meet the other two as well. Let's take a look at quickly his two arguments for this claim. First, he wants to establish that the first efficient cause would also be the ultimate end. And here's his argument for this. 4a. Every per se efficient cause acts for the sake of an end, and a prior efficient cause acts for the sake of a prior end. 4b. Hence, the first efficient cause acts for the sake of the ultimate end. 4c. But the first efficient cause acts principally and ultimately for the sake of nothing other than itself. 4d. Hence, it acts for its own sake as its own end. Conclusion. Therefore, the first efficient cause is the first or ultimate end. How about that the first efficient cause is also the most eminent or most perfect? Here's what he says. 4x. The first efficient cause is not univocal but equivocal with respect to other natures with efficient cause of power. Hence, it is more eminent and nobler than they. Conclusion. Therefore, the first efficient cause is supremely eminent or most perfect. This argument seems less clear to me than the one that establishes the connection between a first efficient cause and the ultimate end. Mostly, I find his arguments concerning the third triple primacy, the one of eminence or the most perfect, I find those a little bit more puzzling than I can make sense of the other ones. But that's what he says. Now let's jump maybe to argument for premise 5, that there could be at most one thing that meets all three descriptions. And here's his argument for that. 5a. Anything that met all three descriptions would be a necessary being, since it would be uncausable in all three respects. Remember that the second component of each three premises is that such a being would be uncausable in each respect. And so if it's uncausable in each three respect, then it is necessarily first efficient cause. It is necessarily final cause, necessarily the most perfect. Second premise, he then gives three arguments for why there could only be one necessary being, of which he gives several arguments for why there can only be one such necessary being. So he establishes that anything that has these three descriptions would be a necessary being, but there can only be one necessary being. Why? He gives three arguments. I want to talk about my favorite one. Here's that argument. 5b. If there were two necessary beings distinct from one another, then at least one of them would need to possess some essential feature that the other lacks, which makes it distinct from the other. 5c. Either this essential feature is itself necessary or not. 5d. But the essential feature of that necessary being cannot itself be necessary, otherwise both necessary beings would have it. 5e. But if a necessary being possesses some essential feature that is not itself necessary, then that being is not a necessary being. Conclusion. Therefore, there cannot be any more than one necessary being. This is very similar to two arguments we've seen already. Avicenna concluded that there could only be one such thing based on the fact that they have to be radically simple. Aquinas argued similarly in the first stage of his de ente argument, which we very briefly went over when we went over the de ente. And so once again, he's using the resources from those authors that come before him. He's just putting it together in a way that no one had done up to this point. What about premise 6, that such a being would have to also be infinite in each respect? Scotus here gives four arguments for this premise, two based on efficient causality, one based on final causality, and one based on eminence or perfection. I'll include here the one based on eminence or perfection. He says, 6a, it is impossible for something to be more perfect than a supremely eminent or most perfect being. 6b, but for any finite being, it is possible for something to be more perfect than it. As we saw in the discussion of St. Anselm's ontological argument and the Lost Island objection and St. Anselm's reply to it. St. Anselm thought that the very notion of an island than which nothing greater can be conceived was incoherent, because what we're trying to do is make an infinite creature out of a finite creature, whereas that which nothing greater can be conceived is not specified as being a finite being, and so we can maximize its properties in infinite directions, so to speak. And so therefore, the supremely eminent and most perfect being is an infinite being. And then he's established premise 6, and then therefore he can reach his conclusion that therefore there exists a being infinite in each respect, and this we all call God. Let me run through the whole argument one more time. Premise 1, there exists a first efficient cause. And we saw various reasons for why he thinks that there's a first efficient cause. He first draws the distinction between essentially ordered efficient causal series and accidentally ordered efficient causal series. He says the accidental ones assume an essential. An essential can't be infinite, so there's got to be a first. Premise 2, that there exists an ultimate final cause. He sort of mysteriously says that, well, you can prove that based on similar arguments as the ones you gave for 1. And then 3, there exists a maximally perfect being, which I didn't go over all the arguments there, but if you're interested, take a look at them in the text. Premise 4, anything that meets any one of these descriptions would also meet the other 2 as well. So you can't have something that is the maximally perfect being, and then there's the final cause, and then there's the efficient cause, as if they were separate things. He thinks that it's all going to collapse into the same thing. In other words, anything that has one of those features or qualities is going to have all 3. But there can only be one thing that has all 3 of those features, and this he reasons from by establishing first that such a being would have to be a necessary being, and so there can't be more than one necessary being, and so you're only going to get one thing that meets all of these 3 descriptions. And he also thinks it's really important to establish, in premise 6, that such a being would also have to be infinite in each respect. And so therefore, he wants to reach the conclusion that there exists a being infinite in each respect, and this we all call God. In many ways, Scotus' argument is a super argument. It borrows from various of Aquinas' arguments. I see elements of the second way. I see elements of the fifth way, the fourth way. I see elements of Aquinas' De Ente argument. We see here some elements of Anselm's ontological argument. Scotus even mentions him by name and says that his argument got a bad rap, that there's something really importantly true about St. Anselm's argument. And then we also saw elements from even Avicenna's argument, some of them passing through Aquinas, but some of them maybe directly from Avicenna, his arguments for why there can only be one necessary being, about how even if we had an infinite series, it still would need a further explanation, so we have to have a first efficient cause. And so what Scotus is doing so masterfully here is that he's bringing in all of the resources. He's taking all of what he thinks are the best arguments for the existence of God found elsewhere, putting them together in a new and interesting way to get them all working together towards the one conclusion that there is a being infinite in each respect, and this we all call God. What I'm interested in are your thoughts about whether this is a successful synthesis. Has he successfully integrated all of these various arguments for the existence of God into one coherent argument? Is he trying to do too much? Right? Should he really have just focused on 1 or 2 of the smaller arguments and not tried to put them all together? Why does he think it's so important to establish that God is infinite in each respect? What do you think is going on there? And because it brings in all of the other arguments that we've seen, does this mean that this is the best argument? This is the super argument? This is the maximally great argument for the existence of God? Or by trying to do too much, does Scotus introduce too many other ways that he can go wrong? I'm interested in your thoughts on these. Contribute to the discussion topic that I'll put on our Canvas page. Next time, we'll talk about Scotus. We did a little bit of his philosophy of religion here, his argument for the existence of God. I want to look at a little bit of his metaphysics, in particular on the problem of universals and individuation.